As you can see, the very crux of the problem here was the difference in ideologies between the US and the USSR. USA, free speech, democracy. USSR, no free speech, and a more totalitarian form of government. This, of course, epitomized the very Cold War itself, with the two sides being so different. As you can see, this creates great amounts of tension between the two systems. It was, of course, symbolized in the kitchen debates between Truman and Stalin, in which each country discussed the merits of their systems of government.
President Wilson agreed to send troops to North Russia after repeated requests were made by the British. The US also sent troops to secure the East Siberian Railroad. Additionally, there was also a small Marine detachment in northern Russia and 50 sailor sharpshooters from the USS Olympia. In August of 1918, the USA deployed troops into Russia to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Bolsheviks. Although the Americans had completely withdrawn by the end of mid-1920, Russia had been wronged. They had, in effect, been invaded.
The Bolshevik Party took the actions of the United States very badly, as they saw them as very anti-communist. This feeling lasted for decades.
At the Tehran Conference in 1943, Winston Churchill had stipulated that Eastern Europe's borders could be changed. But by the Crimea Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt and Churchill refused the idea obstinately. All throughout the alliance, Roosevelt had led Stalin to believe whatever he wanted to believe, to keep the USSR in the war effort against Germany. He insisted later that the region would be Americanized, with an opening to American influence and the American pattern of free elections and representative government. All throughout the war, Roosevelt had kept the American public happy by telling them that there were no spheres of influence, when it turned out that Russia was sticking to their plan that they had agreed on all along. When Russia began to move into the countries within its sphere of influence, the American public protested greatly, while in fact the USSR was only acting on what the US had agreed on.
After the October Revolution in 1917, many of the middle and upper-class Russians fled to Riga, capital of Latvia. The U.S. representatives in Russia also moved to Latvia, and so these two groups had a chance to mingle, and much of American diplomacy from that region of the world was based on American contacts with these high-level Russians now living in Riga.
We had been, I think, for 16 years without any representation in Russia. No relations between the two governments.
Many historians look upon the Riga Axioms as the element that strengthened American resolve against the USSR. These axioms, therefore, hardened what were already harsh feelings towards the Soviet Union in the United States of America.
George Kennan's long telegram is based on information he received from these people, many of whom were quite suspicious of the new Soviet government.
This political force has complete power of disposition over energies of one of the world's greatest peoples and resources of the world's richest national territory. In addition, it has an elaborate and far-flung apparatus for exertion of its influence in other countries, an apparatus of amazing flexibility and versatility.
The American fear of Soviet defense measures stemmed from the fear that these imperialist Russians gave to the American representatives.
The date, August 19th, 1939. Those involved, Ribbentrop and Molotov. Their act, the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. But why would Nazi Germany and Communist Russia sign such an agreement?
While many would believe the Nazi-Soviet Pact was an alliance between the two evil nations of Eastern Europe, the Nazi-Soviet Pact was in fact born more out of necessity than any real desire by the USSR to ally itself with Germany. When Britain and France sent its delegates to the USSR, they did not in fact send any high enough ranking officers to sign the agreement. Stalin was greatly offended by this. Germany, on the other hand, sent its leading foreign minister, Ribbentrop, to sign the agreement. Stalin was impressed, and while he believed that both sides were intent on its destruction, he was much happier signing an agreement with Germany than Britain and France.
Stalin's actions were therefore not offensive, but defensive. On the 16th of July, 1945, the United States tested the world's first atomic weapon in the desert of New Mexico. The development of the Manhattan Project had started in 1941, on the offset of the Second World War, and had culminated in the most powerful weapon the world had ever seen. The destructive power of the blast was beyond the expectations of the American government, and was forever to change the face of diplomacy, international relations, and war. When the news of the successful test reached American President Harry Truman at the Potsdam Conference, witnesses recalled that he was ecstatic. He had pulled out the ultimate playing card. The availability of this new weapon changed the precarious balance of power between what were becoming the Eastern and Western blocs, for their allies now had an atomic monopoly.
The Americans had developed a nuclear weapon with the express intention of using it. They planned to use it against Germany, they planned to use it against Japan, and they planned to use it, if need be, against the USSR.
In the following years, before the development of a Soviet atom bomb, the United States was to create a new strategy of diplomacy: atomic diplomacy. The earliest example of this took place at the Potsdam Conference, when Truman tried to trade the secrets of the atomic bomb for the reorganization of Soviet governments in Bulgaria and Romania. However, this trade of scientific research was given freely to both Canadian and British governments, another poignant exclusion of the Soviet Union. This was not only a weapon of war, but of diplomacy, a policy later to become known as deterrence. Only 1 week after the conference, the United States successfully used the bomb as a weapon of war for the first and last times on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The rush to end the war against Japan was not only to save American servicemen's lives, or even to show the world the true extent of American power, but to keep the Russians from extending their sphere of influence into Japan and the rest of Northeast Asia. Only a few short months before, at the conference in Yalta, while the war against Germany was still raging on, American President Roosevelt had made a deal with Stalin to join in the war against Japan within 3 months of the defeat of Germany, enough time for the Russian people to celebrate the downfall of one enemy and to move the Red Army to the far eastern border of Russia. Upon his rise to power, Truman had promoted the view of Soviet expansionism in Eastern Europe, ignoring Stalin's desire to consolidate his borders to prevent any more losses on the scale of the Second World War. His fear was that Russians would exploit the presence of the Red Army in this part of the world and demand a sphere of influence in this area. In this, they would have been justified, as Russian lives would have been lost and resources depleted even more.